And we're going to be talking for the next hour and 15 minutes or so about H 614. This is the bill that that relates to land improvement fraud and timber trespass. The committee had our legislative counsel come in earlier in the week and walk through the bill. So we're pretty familiar with the actual language. But it would be nice to have your testimony this morning and the testimony of other witnesses who are here today to tell us a little bit about the reality out there on the ground and how this might affect your work and other Vermonters. So, Sam, do you want to start and give us your perspective and just let us know who you are for the record?
Okay. Will do. Thank you. For the record, my name is Sam Lincoln. I own and operate Lincoln Farm Timber Harvesting, a master logger certified mechanized logging operation in Randolph Center. In addition to my career as a farmer and logger in Central Vermont, I also served 4 years as the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation in the Scott administration. Thank you to Representative Mahaley for responding to his constituents' concerns, and thank you to the committee for putting this important issue on your agenda and holding a hearing today. Timber theft is a serious crime with a significant impact and implications for its victims and the greater timber harvesting industry. Prior to serving at FPR, I was aware of some notorious and unscrupulous people who had used timber theft as a mechanism to victimize landowners. As a professional logging contractor, I have a lot of high priority responsibilities, but at the top of that list is transparency, open communication, contract fulfillment, and being accountable to my clients. And I am frustrated that innocent landowners are harmed by timber thieves because of the negative impact on my profession. As a result of the actions of others, I've had people look me in the eye and say there is no such thing as an honest logger, and many other negative connotations associated with the profession. I had been in my role at FPR for about 6 months when I was asked to sit in on a meeting with a landowner that had been taken advantage of by one of these outlaws. As this family described what had occurred, the insufficient and misleading contract, the lack of payment, the damage to their property, the vanishing perpetrator, their subsequent efforts at recovery, and legally assuming responsibility for the restoration of their land while being simultaneously removed from the use value appraisal program, I was shocked that this had occurred and that it was associated with a profession that I am dedicated to. In 2018, I was approached by a gentleman named Mike Caravo, who had a very compelling story about being taken advantage of by someone who cut timber on his property without compensating him. He had compiled a significant amount of evidence of other unscrupulous business practices. Again, as FPR helped to try and advance his complaint, what was even more shocking was the lack of action or follow through by law enforcement and the criminal justice system in his case and others he shared. I will let others testify to the specific authority, roles, and responsibilities that state agencies have, but it was plain that FPR was unable to do much more than report this and urge law enforcement to investigate these crimes. FPR has a statewide network of foresters with the resources to help landowners with forest management, outreach materials with standard procedures and checklists that should be implemented before moving forward with a timber sale, but not everyone reaches out to them, and FPR has very little enforcement responsibility. The people that were victimized are unforgettable to me, and I feel that by not sufficiently investigating the complaints and delivering consistent and predictable punishment for this crime and offense, that law enforcement and the judicial system is adding insult to injury. A Google search of timber trespass in Vermont reveals that our hearing and discussion today is not an emerging issue. Our laws are not being enforced. People are not being held accountable. This erodes our faith in government to step in and protect citizens from harm. If the statutory changes proposed in H 614 are what prosecutors need to act, then we are ready to discuss them and ensure they are effective at punishing criminals while avoiding unintended consequences to the inadvertent offender or the unforeseen circumstances, which are real. Our steering committee of the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast, our Vermont steering committee, discussed this issue, and some real-time and important scenarios were brought up where a logging contractor was involved in a timber trespass lawsuit or claim And we're very concerned about any inadvertent situation that puts them in light as being a criminal rather than something that's happened. With all their careful planning and professionalism, there can still be unintentional mistakes that occur. The cynical part of me wonders if we should even worry about that because of the demonstrated lack of enforcement in this realm. But that's not how we're approaching the discussion. We're here in good faith to try and solve a problem associated with our profession, but like many other initiatives taken up by the legislature, just writing down new laws on paper doesn't solve a problem until we get at the root cause and core issue. In this case, we believe that it is a lack of enforcement and a clear path to restitution and justice for the victims. We all need to learn and understand why the same bad actors are operating unbothered and how to prevent this from continuing to occur. When I submit my written comments to the committee assistant, I will include links to stories that go back as far as 15 years about some of these issues, so you can see that this is a bit of deja vu for us. So thank you for allowing me to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Representative O'Brien.
Sam, was there a connection between the fallout from timber trespass and that landowner who then fell out of current use?
Well, I think that, and I'm not a current use value appraisal expert, but I think typically what happens is you're removed, if there's a cut contrary is what it's called when somebody over harvests or harvests in contrary to your plan. There is a removal process and they have to follow the benefit is removed. They pay their assessed tax value for a period of time. I think it's 5 years, but someone else may correct me if that is an expert. And then they can be reinstated into the program, but they also are responsible for the damage to the trails. That particular case, I think that the logger had done 9 stream crossings with no appropriate structures in place. I mean, it was just devastation. And again, as others have said, I hate to label these people with being loggers because I don't think I think they're thieves that have chosen this profession. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it just sounds like an awful sort of compounding situation.
Yep, that was.
We can ask the tax department to come in and clarify whether in fact somebody who fell victim to this kind of crime would be further aggravated, aggrieved by having their current use status revoked. That's terrible. Other questions? Dana, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I've got testimony to provide, but I can wait until the committee's finished with questions to Sam.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. Back. Representative Lipsky.
Chairman Durfee, just one recommendation. Sean Thompson's a forester with FPR who specializes in current use and use value appraisals, and he would maybe be a better source to go through for the point of if timber theft or abuses occur.
Great, thank you. With it. Okay. I don't see any other hands. So Dana, if you have testimony, we'd love to hear that.
Okay, terrific. Good morning, Representative Durfee, Representative Supranant, Representative Graham, and members of the House Committee on Agricultural, Food, Resiliency, and Forestry. My name is Dana Duran. I'm the Executive Director of a trade association called the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast. PLC is a trade association that represents logging and associated trucking contractors throughout the Northeast, and most specifically in the state of Vermont. I apologize I wasn't able to be there today, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify via Zoom. So I appear before you today on behalf of the membership of the PLC from Vermont to testify in support of H614, an act relating to land improvement fraud and trespass. Timber harvesters are not generally in favor of more government regulation. However, we believe that the legislation before you today is an important step forward to professionalize the industry in Vermont, protect landowners, and ensure that this industry moves forward without a black eye that clearly, based upon Sam's testimony, has festered for decades. I'd also like to thank Representative Mahaley for sponsoring the legislation and working very closely with our organization, the Vermont Attorney General, and the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation to ensure it has been written correctly and has broad support. Timber trespass and timber theft are crimes that have plagued the industry for decades throughout the Northeast, and especially here in Vermont. Timber thieves, not reputable professional logging contractors, have operated in the state far too long because they have not had the weight of law nor enforcement to ensure that their activities are eliminated. There are well-established examples of timber thievery that go back decades, as Sam mentioned. While this bill is not perfect and there's still the longstanding issue of enforcement that must be focused upon, it is our belief that it will go a long way to eliminate illegal timber harvesting by habitual offenders and improve the public's trust for logging contractors that operate responsibly and ethically. For background, the PLC began working with Representative Mahaley back in early December when he reached out to us to ensure the legislation would be something we could support. While not opposed to the premise and reason for the bill, we did not want this bill to be a one-size-fits-all approach that could ultimately harm contractors that did something inadvertently by accident or unknowingly. This was by far the biggest issue that our membership in Vermont felt strongly about, was that accidents happen and contractors who admit fault and or pay their debt should not be held liable nor be subject to the stipulations in the bill. Thus, it is our belief that the language before you does indeed protect those who do things by accident and are willing to own up to their mistakes. It has enough fail-safe protection in it that those who do not make who do make mistakes and pay their debts will not be swept up with those who don't. We also believe the legislation before you today is not inconsistent with that which exists in other states. As an example, I have attached a statute and rules created in Maine over a decade ago that deal specifically with this issue. In 2013, the Maine legislature provided the Maine Forest Service with statutory authority to create rules that could require a habitual offender previously convicted of timber theft and or timber trespass on 2 prior occasions in the last 5 years that they must receive written approval from the Maine Forest Service to operate. They must post a private bond in the amount of $500,000 and be subject to work stoppage requirements if they were not meeting the letter of the law. Maine has a Forest Practices Act with civil and criminal penalties for timber trespass and timber theft under the authority of the Maine Forest Service and the state's Attorney General. But for the purposes of comparison, the authority provided by the bill before you today would be very similar to Maine. Again, I have attached a copy of the law and rules for Maine for your review. While we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, we believe there is an elephant in the room that must be dealt with if this legislation goes forward. That issue is enforcement. In discussions with Representative Mahaley and Danielle Fitzko, Commissioner of the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec, we have asked that the bill be amended to include a study due back to this committee on or before January 15th of 2025, which would focus on 2 primary pieces. 1, current issues pertaining to enforcement of timber theft and trespass laws with recommendations for staffing and budget implications to improve such enforcement based upon statutory requirements. And 2, a report on the cost, schedule for implementation, and required statutory changes if a harvest notification system with trip tickets was implemented by the state for improving harvest monitoring and mill delivery monitoring to ensure consumer protection and to reduce illegal harvest of timber in the state. The Attorney General and State Attorney would lead this study and consult with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec, the Department of Public Safety, the PLC, perhaps the Vermont Forest Products Association, and other interested parties regarding those issues. It's our opinion that while the new statute will provide a deterrent, a law is only as good as its enforcement. If the law can't be implemented and enforced because there are staffing and budgetary issues, there must be a plan for how to deal with this. Also, Vermont does not have a Forest Practices Act, which mandates harvest notifications, trip tickets, etc. So if there is no trip ticket mandate that creates a track and trace chain of evidence where forest products move to, if a thief steals wood and gets paid for it after delivering it to a mill, and there's no reporting system nor responsibility amongst all the players in the chain, again, what good is the law? In closing, we believe that this is a well thought out solution to a decades-long problem, but we must solve the entire problem and ensure that the law can be enforced and will be enforced by all that play a role. Happy to answer any questions you have, and thanks again for letting me testify via Zoom.
Okay, thank you, Dana. Let's see, we have a couple questions. Representative Levitt.
Oh, I guess, Dana, my first question, I only have one right now, is Maine has a $500,000 bond and ours is only a $50,000 bond. And I'm curious if you could speak to how you feel about the differences.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Representative. So, Maine really took a very hard line with this. There was significant issues over the years, and our industry testified in support of the bill. We testified in support of the rules, and we felt that if you're going to put your money where your mouth is, the contractors who have been found guilty of this and have to comply with the rules had to put that money before them. So that $500,000 bond was appropriate from our perspective. What the committee decides to do, whether you keep it at 50,000 or you move it to $500,000, inevitably that's up to you, but there has to be a deterrent.
Do you think 50,000? Do you think 50,000 is enough of a deterrent?
Well, it's an insurance policy. I mean, that's what a bond is. So you're not paying the full value, you're paying premium. So it's really, I would maybe have the committee ask an insurance agent what it costs to get a bond for 50,000 versus a bond for $500,000. And that's going to tell you how expensive it truly is and whether 50,000 is a deterrent in Vermont or not. Every insurance market's different and it's regulated by the state.
Thank you.
Representative Lipsky.
Dana, thank you for testifying via Zoom. Just in listening to Representative Levitt's question, it occurs to me that the typical size of a logging concession in the state of Maine, which is more vast, may be significantly larger than sometimes we operate on as small as 5 or 10 acre contracts, or 40 or 50, but not several hundred acre units. That may reflect why the values are so different on the bonding cap.
It certainly might, Representative Lipsky. With respect to most timber trespass cases in Maine, those cases have been adjudicated predominantly on small landowners, anywhere from 20 to 100 acres, because in those cases, you are trespassing on another boundary. So usually they've happened in more residential suburban areas than they've occurred on large industrial land. So those have been the biggest issues. So you might be right, but I would say in this case with timber trespass, they usually are happening on very similar sized acres, regardless of geographic boundary.
Just as a follow-up on that count, I would reckon I'm not correct, that it may be comparable, given your
Representative O'Brien. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Just to follow up on Representative Levitt's question, did you do due diligence in Maine on the enforcement part of that bill? And now, in hindsight, are you seeing a reduction in the sort of timber trespass that was happening before?
Sure. As I mentioned in my testimony, enforcement in Maine versus Vermont it's a whole different world. Maine has a Forest Practices Act that was put in place about 30 years ago. So the criminal and civil components are in Maine law, and they're under the jurisdiction of the Maine Forest Service in collaboration with the state's attorney general. So there's a much different body of law in Maine and a very much different bureaucracy that exists in terms of enforcement. The state has forest rangers that go out and inspect every single timber harvesting job because you have to have a forest operations notification that's posted in advance of a harvest in Maine. So there is along with trip tickets, so there's a very big bureaucracy involved in Maine with respect to track and trace. That being said, I know the Forest Service felt that they were going after folks and they would fine them, and they may or may not pay the fine, but they could fine them 5 times and yet they could still operate because they basically included that fine as a cost of doing business. Putting this very statute in Maine 10 years ago is really what has led to a mass reduction in the level of criminal activity because of the bond, because of the stop work order, and because they have to get, frankly, written notification to even start a job. So it's taking care of it very quickly.
We had a bit of a conversation the other day, Dana and Sam, about a provision in the language in our bill involving seizure of equipment. Sounds like maybe don't have that in Maine, Dana, so that's a question, but also just wondering about the practicality and logistics of seizing large equipment. Be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
I'll go first, and Sam can feel free to chime in. So, direct answer to your question: no, there is no seizure component in Maine statute with respect to criminal timber trespass and timber theft. I think that the state has chosen to go about it a little bit differently, but again, it's a much more advanced regime of laws and bureaucracy that can enforce those laws in Maine. I'm sure that if it got to the point where they had to seize it because of whatever they needed to do, there's probably another statute they could lend to, but it's never gotten to that point. So we didn't feel like that had to happen, nor was it ever, actually, to my knowledge, it was never recommended. So I think, back to the committee, you can decide whether the bond limit is enough. There might be some pieces from the Maine statute and rules that you might want to employ in terms of written notification and stop work order and things of that nature that might be an alternative to seizure.
Other questions? Committee. Okay. Are you able to stay on the call, Sam and Dana? Okay, great. Thank you. So we're gonna turn now to some landowners who I understand have been victims of timber trespass here in Vermont. And if you're able to stay and hear their testimony, that'd probably be helpful. So we've got 2 witnesses, I think. Do you care who goes first? Okay, come on up, sir.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and taking an interest in this long overdue problem.
Thank you for joining us. If you could just start by giving us your name.
Yeah, my name is Mike Carroll. I'm from Plainfield, Vermont. Obviously a senior citizen and a veteran. And I have a little story for you today, similar to a lot of other stories. Thank you for asking me to testify today as a victim of nefarious loggers. I appreciate this opportunity to clarify my story of victimization by, I was told not to say the people's names, and point out many others were also victims of these people and another family of loggers in northern Vermont. I admit I was naive in my understanding of entering into a contact with such hardened criminals, but my cousin was married to one of them, and an adjoining neighbor was enjoying the execution of his contract with these same people, to the best of my knowledge. I know now I should have contacted Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, or a forester on my selection of contractors. While they may not have been able to disclose the nefarious history of these people, they could have guided me to an honorable business, or so I thought. I entered into both a verbal and written contract with these people on September 6, 2018. I noted certain stipulations were needed to be put in place to clarify my position on the contract, and they agreed to these added stipulations and proceeded to continue working on the 2 adjoining properties. Shortly thereafter, they came onto my property, dragging my logs to my neighbor's adjoining shared log landing. My neighbor approached me shortly after and asked if I had received any payment for logs. He had not, and it had been 2 weeks. I told him I had not received anything and contacted the other adjoining neighbor about his current experience with these people. He stated he had been paid for the first 4 loads of logs a while ago, but nothing since then. We all realized something was amiss and collectively contacted one of these concerning the matter. We were all told by this person various stories of delays, deals, and about a fire in one of his tenants' apartments. Promises were made, but never fulfilled. On December 31st, 2018, I heard some heavy equipment traveling above my house and realized the logging operation was leaving our locations, headed to another undisclosed location with no acknowledgement of intentions. Shortly thereafter, I found their operation on an adjoining property and confronted one of them. And he told me he had used my money for a deal that he had made, and I would get paid Friday, which never happened. I went back to the landing later, only to confront another one of the loggers who told me he was going to counterclaim, stating I had owed him for tree service. This was never discussed or part of any contract. Later in court proceedings, the judge stated no evidence could be substantiated to support his claim, and I won the judgment. This was the start of my involvement with the following: Vermont State Police, the AGO's CAP division of the AG's office, Washington County Superior Court, Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, Commissioner Mike Snyder, and Deputy Commissioner Sam Lincoln, Rep. Robert Leclerc, Vermont Forest Products Association, numerous senators, and the AG's criminal division. Because of these interactions with these parties, I found at least 27 other victims with remarkably similar stories of victimization. Most are voting senior citizens with some military service with claims of non-payment, failure to adhere to both the verbal and written contracts, partial payments, and damage to properties. A good deal of those injured did not go to court because it was well known by the general population. Restitution was not, and I repeat, not going to be forthcoming. Most businesses pointed out they knew the system favors the predators, and throwing money at a lawyer was a waste of time and effort. They would be better off working to recap their loss. I, on the other hand, went to court, won the judgment, won the counterclaim. The oral argument and these people failed to show for a financial disclosure, which is their standard modus operandi. By this time, I realized the goalpost was constantly shifting at my expense. And when the judge asked me if I wanted to file a contempt of court charge, I reached saturation and contacted Rep. Mark Mahaley, and he has been instrumental in helping me bring light upon this ongoing situation. For me, this battle for justice started as an ongoing battle to make myself and others whole again, monetarily. I soon realized it could not happen without the help of those in positions of authority. You and others could not only potentially recapture the lost nest egg many seniors were planning to use to enhance their livelihoods, but provide a strong deterrent to those taking unfair advantage of vulnerable citizens. Thank you for asking me to testify, and we, my victims group, past and possibly future victims, look forward to your positive involvement in this long overdue problem. Thank you for your consideration, Mike Caribou.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Let's see if you have time to take questions, if we've got.
I'll stay here all day.
Just tell us again when your initial contact was, the start of your story.
Well, actually, it happened twice. One of the brothers came to my property maybe 2 or 3 years before the actual contract was signed on September 6, 2018, and gave an estimate of what it would cost, what I could expect off that property. Yet when they came to my property and after everything was settled, It was way less than that. And that was in 2016. And the part that made this one kind of difficult was two adjoining properties joined in that, the logging operation at the same time, and we shared the same log landing. So keeping track of what was happening was extremely difficult.
2016, the rough timeframe.
2018,
2018, okay. Did you ever receive any payment at all?
nothing.
Oh, wow.
The other ones, one received the payment for the first 4 loads of logs, but never received anything for the rest of the logs. The other one wasn't getting anything. And I formed a victims group between those two, and we collectively got together sharing information and what we could do to resolve this. And found out roughly what he owed, and he was paid, and they made sure they wrote on the bill that he received full payment. And then myself, I never received anything. And then as a consequence of going to court and having to subpoena mill slips and trip tickets because they weren't readily accessible, and yet they're just as much mine as they are anybody else's. I found out there were way more loads of logs that were never even mentioned as far as belonging to any of us, and yet they were delineated in those mill slips and trip tickets to us. Yet there was another, I think, 10 or 15 loads of logs that didn't have anybody's name on them.
So just to be certain that I understand, you never received a payment from the loggers.
Correct.
Were you compensated after a court settlement?
No. Because about that time, sir, I found out that it was a constant moving of the goalpost. Every time I won something, being naive about how the court system works, I thought I had won. I won the judgment. And then they came up with this bogus claim of they were actually doing a tree service for me, which was obviously a lie. And then I thought, well, it's done now. I've proved, their counterclaim is bogus. And then all of a sudden it became an oral argument. And I won that. And then they said, well, now we're going to do a financial disclosure. The court made a mistake thinking that only the person that had signed the document was responsible, I guess. And he failed to show for the financial disclosure. So then they put the other people's names on the thing, and they refused to show for a thing. And then the judge kind of laughingly said, well, would you like to file for contempt of court? And I said, why? And he says, I said, is that going to cost me money? He says, why, of course it is. And I said, why? It's contempt of your court, sir, and you, not me.
That's where you said earlier, if I remember correctly, you had reached your saturation point or the.
Pretty much. And he said that was not his venue. And I told him, well, sir, here's your chance to make a difference. You can petition the government. You can go see the legislators, tell them what's happening and tell them you want the laws changed.
Can you give us just a rough sense of how much money to the extent that you understand, how much money you should have gotten for that harvest?
Well, what they claimed they only owed me was like $2,500. But I had the best set of logs of everybody. I had the most hardwood. And the accounting that they did on the trip tickets and mill slips is very erroneous, extremely erroneous. In fact, the one that they said won, whereas all the others had 14 to 20, gave me one, was the wrong one. It wasn't even the right number. It shouldn't even come to me. Mine was actually a lesser amount than the one they awarded to me. But the judge said, when I was pointing out to the judge that there were actually X amount more mill slips that belonged to all of us. And he said, and they weren't numbered, so you didn't know who they were. And I said, a good deal of those are mine. And he says, do you know exactly which they are? And I said, I don't know. And he says, well, I can't award you anything for ones when you don't actually know who it belongs to. So about this time, like I say, I'd reached saturation and I realized that I was fighting a system that was doing nothing for me.
Thank you for sharing that story.
You're welcome.
And if you can stay.
Well, I will stay.
Great. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. My name is Peter Youngbear. I'm also a resident of Plainfield and a victim of timber theft by the same person. And I was going to mention names, but Mike's comment was that wasn't a good idea. What do you advise?
I don't think for our purposes, names are necessary.
Okay. We'll just leave it at that. My wife and I own a little over 21 acres in Plainfield, half wooded. Because of the size, we are not in the current use program, a small wood lot. When we bought the property, we really fell in love with it. It's a half open field. And we have very large gardens there, grow most of our own food there. And the woods was a very nice mix. There's one section that is cedar, so like all my garden posts I can cut out of there, very nice, and we've cut and sold some of those over the years. It's mostly softwood, a little bit of hardwood, and part of that hardwood are some really gorgeous 200-plus-year-old maple trees, real giants. They are gorgeous trees. We had a very nice logging experience by a fellow who logs with a team of horses. If you've ever experienced that, it's a beautiful sight to see them in the woods in the wintertime. He was a neighbor, wrote up a nice little contract with us, gave us the slips or whatever when they came back. I do remember that Sir Sosimo Lumber down in Brattleboro specifically asked for one of those 200-year-old maple trees. They were doing a veneer project, and I mean, these trees are like this, and that one tree netted us $4,000, I remember. That was striking. So another Plainfield neighbor, that was the person that Mike mentioned, kept coming by every year or so saying, hey, we'd like to cut your woods and stuff like this. And finally in 2016, I believe it was, we said, sure, come on in and do it. Would you write up a little contract? And so he did that for us. And in retrospect, I think I was pretty naive about those contract provisions, but figuring this was a neighbor, we ought to and we had a prior good experience, so we take it from there. So I've since learned a lot in the meantime. So the crew showed it up and started working, and boy, they brought in some big equipment that I'd never seen before. I don't know the name of it, but that thing grabs it by the stump and cuts it right off. And yeah. Like, wow, that's pretty impressive. And they put up a little landing right near the front of our house so I could walk over every couple of days and find out how things were going. And all I heard were complaints. Oh, the wood market's terrible. I don't know if I'm going to be able to sell it. I have to take some of this over to New Hampshire, he said, and sell it over there. They did take out a bunch of cedar. That was like the first thing they focused on. I think that was probably the most lucrative from their point of view. But I remember trailer load after trailer load of chips that probably went to the McNeil plant in Burlington. So mostly they were taking out softwoods. We never saw any slips. We never saw a penny of money. The one thing that he did promise was that he said, when we're done, the woods will be pretty much of a mess. And they were. And pretty much years later still are. We used to have a nice logging trail loop that went down into the woods. There was one stream crossing. It's an intermittent stream, a seasonal type thing. And that trail is just about unwalkable these days. There's so much stuff that they just left littered around. In the fall of 2016, I ran into this logger at a fundraising event for a nonprofit that I was running. We were at the Canadian Club in Barrie, And he apparently had been working as part of the kitchen crew, saw my wife and I at the event and pulled us into a side room and started just bawling his eyes out. Oh, I'm so sorry. Things have been so tough, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get you $2,000 by Christmas. Okay, you know, felt sorry for the guy. That's the last communication we've ever had with him. Never said anything. And I have no idea whether that $2,000 is what he owes us, and I suspect it's quite a bit more than that. So, just based on the earlier logging. Then I started hearing from others in town when we started, you know, making, so, oh, yeah, they're terrible people. Oh, you'll never get your money back. The kinds of things that Mike was talking about, you know, you can sue them and you still won't get anything. And so basically we ate it, you know, to make a long story short. Last year, I think it was a town meeting. At the end of the meeting, Mike stood up and told us, you know, the town, here's this thing. If anyone else had experience, you know, would like to hear from you. So we got hooked up and been to a couple meetings and started hearing the stories and stuff. And just want to thank Representative Mahaly for also listening in and picking up the ball and running with it. And so we're happy to be here to tell you our story. And having read through the bill looked pretty good to me. I am a former legislator, so the language was pretty good. I was Title this, Title 18. Okay, you're in the criminal statutes. Yep. I can't speak to some of the questions you had as to whether $50,000 bond is appropriate. I did like seeing the provisions about forfeiture, because I think unless you take away the ways of livelihood and really say to these folks, you know, you can't keep doing this. Something will have to happen. That's probably Judiciary Committee business, but I would say looks good for me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative Templeman.
I'm just curious, are we talking about the same
Yes.
logging company here? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we're talking about, I didn't mention names, but yes.
Yes. Okay.
I know from our conversations that yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read, you know, the court stuff. I mean, Mike's provided us with a lot of information, so.
Representative O'Brien.
A question for both of you. Was there a conversation with the mills where some of this purpose ended up, just because it's stolen property? So I think mills would be anxious about working with people.
I had not, because I never saw a slip, so I have no idea where he took the stuff. Quite frankly.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, generally, people testifying from the side, but we can bring anybody else back up again if we, if the committee would like to. But, so we'll hold any questions. We'll have you come back. Representative Lipsky.
Yeah. To the two witnesses that we've just heard from, I just have a comment. And it's imperative to me to make this comment because I've been a logger for over 50 years. And like one of the earlier witnesses, Sam Lincoln, who's sitting in the cab of what I believe to be a fellow buncher, it is beyond appalling to me what you and other victims of this kind of thievery and abuse is. And one of the most responsibilities I have of being a legislator who sits on this committee who has a lifelong experience both in the woods and in leadership. It is so disturbing to hear the details, and these are not original stories or unique. It's why this committee is, and the organization of professional loggers of the Northeast has been so willing and appreciative of Representative Mahaly's bill. And we will do what we can to protect all victims, but the more older and vulnerable that have relied on this asset to be stripped of it is is why I'm here.
Well, I want to say thank you for those comments. Much appreciated. I'm real supportive of the forestry industry. I see Ed Larson over here, worked with Ed for many years here in the legislature. Well, neither of us had gray hair back then, but I represented part of the district that Representative Mahaly had, and have many people in the current use program, very familiar with that. And, the forest industry is huge for this state. So we need it to be a good industry. And we got some bad actors. So I'm glad the industry is stepping up to help get rid of those bad apples.
Representative Graham?
Do you know if this business is still in operation?
Excuse me?
Do you know if this business is still in operation?
As far as I know.
Yeah, pretty sure I had a neighbor that fell into that, probably the same company. And would logged off and everything in the end. I know it's if the company was from the same territory you're talking about.
Representative Levitt?
I just, do you feel like this company is targeting seniors specifically? Or are they casting a wider net than that? I'm curious.
I don't have a sense of that.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't consider myself a senior in 2016 when they came around.
Right, right.
I'm 71, but I guess I was, But I think, apparently the history has been that the victims have been.
The victims tend to be seniors?
Yeah.
Okay.
I could
Yeah, well,
tell the chair, we can provide you some documentation that might help. One of the victims got a judgment, victimized and got a judgment for $240,000, and she's a senior citizen. And we can provide the judgment and the information to the committee.
I was going to ask Sam or Dana, and this may be a difficult question to put a number on, but just to give the committee a sense, and now we do have a sense because of the number you just gave, but we heard a considerably smaller number from our other two witnesses. Is there a way to quantify if you were doing a logging operation on a 20-acre parcel or some other size land? What would a landowner typically earn from that? Even like order of magnitude might be helpful for us.
Do you want me to take that? Chairman Durfee, is that for me?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry, Sam. Yes, if you could.
It's a variable number. It all depends on the timber type, the terrain, the distance. It has to be skid to the roadside, depends on current markets. But we've had contracts that were maybe only for a few $1,000s up into, six figures. That's just my slice of Central Vermont. It is often almost always many thousands of dollars involved. One thing, if I may expand a little bit and bring some context to something that other witnesses have mentioned with regard to slips and trip tickets. If I may, Mr. Chairman Durfee.
Yeah.
So when we're harvesting timber, we're sorting out all different types of products. The job we're on right now, there's pine logs, maple, 3 different grades of maple logs, different grades of birch logs. There's different types of pulp that all are going to different markets. There's trucks leaving frequently with loads going to markets around the state and the region. And we have a mailbox on the job where every trucker, every load that goes out, they fill out a what's called a numbered trip ticket. It's in triplicate. The mill gets a copy. We have a copy. The trucker keeps a copy. And so when that load goes to the mill, it either goes across a set of scales that weigh it. It goes to a sawmill or a log yard where every single log is measured for length, diameter, graded by quality, and it's written down. And when I get a check within a week or two for that load of logs or that product, the corresponding trip ticket number is on there, so I can reconcile what left that day and what's been settled. And I give the landowner a weekly settlement with a photocopy or a scan of the trip ticket, the mill scale sheet that, again, a load of maple logs might have 100 logs, 145 logs on it. Every single log is tracked by length, diameter, and grade. And the landowner gets a copy of that with the corresponding payment per grade and species in the contract on a weekly basis, and then a settlement, and then a summary at the end. And that's, I think, typical. I don't see what other people's business practices are, but that's standard. The loggers that I work with, the foresters I work with, that's pretty standard practice. There are other scenarios that may not employ all those different levels. If what's called lump sum, where the logger might pay one price in a bidding situation, where they might just write one check to the landowner, where that level of disclosure of there's been some other background work by a professional to determine the volume and value of the timber. But that's the two victims here the witnesses that are testifying. That's the scenario. They were going to be paid a percentage or a value based on what was delivered to the mill, and they did not receive that level of documentation and transparency. And I just wanted to provide that context that's what they should have received, that dealing with a more reputable business person. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Good. Well, let's see. I know that there are some other folks, or that some of the folks sitting around the perimeter of the room were maybe hoping to answer some of the questions that we had earlier. So, and you had scheduled for testimony next week. You want to just wait until then? Okay. And Mike, do you want to come back up? And was there anything that you didn't get to say from the corner there that you wanted to add?
You can sit, it's okay.
There was the mention, I believe Sam brought it up, about being, what could happen as a result of being kicked out of a program for the state. This particular family had to go out and plant new trees to bring them back into compliance of having X amount of trees on their property, if I heard them right. And I'm pretty sure it is current use.
Oh.
Okay.
And I'm just a wealth of knowledge here, just ask for it.
I think we have, sadly, a picture anyway of what's happened. Representative Templeman.
I just have a question for Dana, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Dana, I'm sorry, the camera's here. You mentioned that the Maine law doesn't have a seizure component to it. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure. And you have I attached to my testimony, which you should have received electronically, both the Maine law and the rules, just for your reference.
Thank you.
I just got one other, this issue has been going on for decades. My father, back in the late 50s, adjoining landowner was having logging done. And found out that when that lot was done, the logger went over onto father's property, cutting out maples. Father approached him and he said, if you want me to stop, you gotta go to court. The court ordered to stop, which he did. And, he took out most of the maple stand that was there at the time. And he got enough money to pay for the lawyer. That was it. I mean, it's been going on for a long, long time. It is time to stop it.
Representative O'Brien.
I just wanted to get Mike back to you. You sure about the mill question?
I could answer that.
Yeah.
I didn't have much to do with the people up north, but Central Vermont I did. And that's their modus operandi, is to go to court, represent themselves, knowing that they've been to the court, been through all the systems of protocol that go in there, knowing that all they have to do is just keep showing up. And that in the end, knowing that there's no enforcement, that it doesn't matter. You're just wasting your time to go to court. And the only one that's having any problem with that is the victim is having insult added to injury. Not only was all this done to him on top of violations of the AMP or damage to the property, like the gentleman over there was just saying, all of a sudden now you got to pay for subpoenas for something that should be yours to look at just as much as anyone else's. And then you've got to go to these people, approach them, which was something was brought up earlier about what did the mills say if you went to them. The mills that I contacted were pretty much gassed at what was happening. They were aware, they'd heard stories of this happening. Trying to think what their name was. I haven't said their name in a while, but it's just in Bath, Maine. Londonderry, not Londonderry, but Sam would know it. Anyway, I went and talked to them, explained the whole situation, what had going on, and they told these loggers that they could not bring any more logs to that mill until I got paid. And then the loggers got a hold of me and told them that they were going to do this and that and everything to me because I had cost them that account. And I never heard anything, and then judgments came through, and it was pretty bogus what they were saying. I mean, I found that, and when like I say, when the court supplied me with all 3 log landings, which was the only way I could know what was taken, because they were all sharing the same landing. And because of that, and I got to see the trip tickets and mill slips and compare them, as Mr. Lincoln said. That's when I discovered how much was actually taken from us. I would have never known. And then they just supplied, I keep wanting to say their name, what mill slips they want you to see, not necessarily what was actually taken.
Representative O'Brien had a question.
You answered most of that, but one thing, just looking online, and maybe Sam, you would know this from your time at FPR, the same company seems to have violated the AMPs, the acceptable management practices during a logging job, and found in violation by the state of Vermont. Typically, what is the enforcement, at that point for a logging company?
I think I would, the state, the Department of Environmental Conservation has a environmental enforcement team, and FPR has watershed and AMP foresters. I really should defer to them, but there is a process for AMP complaints, violations. There's a report on the FPR watershed page of how many they investigate, how many are taken to enforcement, how many are resolved. But the department has all that information, and it's been 3 years since I left, so I wouldn't want to say anything that's not current. But there is a process in which enforcement happens. But there are logging contractors that have not paid their AMP violations that are still they've still not been paid.
All right, thank you, Sam.
Did you want to try and answer?
I can answer that.
Yeah, please.
They do have a different division that is specifically for collecting debts. The only trouble is they didn't collect the debts. They were unable to collect them from both these people that are discussed. And one of them has a debt that was $41,000 in fines that they never collected. The other one has at least 4, 13, 17, 21, and 23, I think it is. And they were never collected.
Representative Lipson.
Yeah, just from my experience, if there are AMP violations that were committed by a contractor, and if they are not repaired or brought back into compliance, the responsibility to do that inevitably ends with the landowner. And they then bear the brunt cost.
Insult to injury again.
Insult to injury, but that's how it works. So If that logger leaves the state or leaves the region, the landowner is still responsible, ultimately responsible for bringing into compliance any deficiencies.
Exactly.
Representative Levitt had a question.
I was just gonna ask, and I'm not sure, it feels like there are two bad actors in this, which are the loggers and also the mills who are accepting lumber that hasn't been properly ticketed, for lack of a better phrase. And I'm wondering sort of how do we address that piece of it?
So I think what we might want to do is, you can try and answer that question. We may want to get some testimony from people who can, dig into that. And then, I see Dana has a hand up too. Dana.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Durfee. So I had referenced it in my testimony that we've made a recommendation to Representative Mahaley and talked to Danny Fitzko, Commissioner at VPFR, about this very issue. And that is the track and traceability. There is no track and trace requirement in Vermont statute. So Sam is a representative, as is Representative Lipsky, of upstanding professional contractors who have trip tickets, provide settlement sheets, do the right thing, but that's not required in law. There's no responsibility from the perspective of a mill to provide that trip ticket back. There's no requirement of contractors to have trip tickets to go back to landowners. So we have made that recommendation that there must be a study to determine is this a system that Vermont wants? What's it going to cost? Who's going to have oversight? I mean, you're not going to answer this right away. It's going to take time, but that does not exist currently. And I'll say something further, not germane directly to that question, but the rotten apple spoils the bushel. And that's what we're most concerned about with this type of behavior that's occurred to these landowners that you've heard from, is it paints a black eye on all contractors. And Sam talked about it. Right. And it also depresses prices in the long run. As long as there's cheap wood that's stolen from people and then given to a mill, it keeps prices down for the rest of the contractors. And that is a concern of ours as well. So this has major systemic issues with it.
Interesting point. Yes. Go ahead.
Again, Dana, so
right,
the stolen wood is being sold to the mills at a lower price. Is that the implication here? No. So where
not necessarily, but it could be. But it also, it's a supply and demand issue. The more supply that's out there, it keeps prices down.
Right. Okay.
It's sense, but yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you to all of the witnesses who came in this morning to help us better understand this issue. Thank you, former member, for visiting us as well. But we do have more testimony scheduled next week, and then a few more suggestions I think came up today. So this won't be a bill that we are voting out in the next few days, and I think we'll have plenty of time to dig into it as more questions come up. Yes, yeah.
Sam or Dana, do you think there'd be a large opposition to doing mandating trip tickets?
So there's been legislation proposed in the past to address some of these things, and I think that right now with industry at the table, it might be more successful. I think that loggers are frustrated enough that that there's an appetite to maybe support it this time around, and but again, it has to. To me, it's not an administrative burden what we're talking about right now. There are additional things that we're proposing that could be, but it needs to be like anything we put in place that's a burden on the legitimate logging force out there needs to also be productive and at combating the timber thieves. And I think that's what we want to see is if these things are put in place. What's missing from enforcement now? And what would be put in place that would make it effective, predictable, consistent, so that we're not all dealing with this and people are properly acted. These complaints are properly acted upon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that, something like that in a way is be a benefit to everybody. Be able to-
I feel the industry should not fear transparency, and but if everyone has to be, if it's going to be effective, the rule followers will continue to follow the rules. If there's not enforcement, we keep circling back to if it's not enforced, then how does it become effective?
Thank you for that answer, and it's a good question. We would definitely want to understand the impacts and where the burdens were, and as you said, recognize that there needed to be an advantage overall if we were going to impose those additional costs, burdens. Representative O'Brien.
Just quickly, Dana, could you fill us in on AMPs in Maine, both, how similar they are to here enforcement? You said there's a much different sort of bureaucracy and enforcement situation in Maine. And so hopefully we'll hear that what Representative Lipsky just said is that the landowners don't have to pay to clean up after a really, a violation of AMPs.
Yep. So the regime in Maine with respect, we call them BMPs, so best management practices in Maine. So the enforcement for BMPs is with the state's Forest Service. So as I said, you have in Maine, again, a different regime of statute and rules where a contractor and or landowner, and they do it collaboratively, and or forester have to submit a forest operations notification before they can start a harvest. That what we call a FONS then triggers a number to the job. And then at some point that job is going to receive a visit from a Maine forest ranger. There's an entire, again, bureaucracy of staff that are charged with going out and inspecting jobs. They're going to inspect a job before, during, after a harvest. If there's a complaint by the landowner, they're going to go out and they're going to review those BMPs, the closeouts, etc. If there's a water quality issue, they're going to call the contractor, and that responsibility is going to fall upon the contractor ultimately to take care of the issue. It will only fall on the landowner if they, through the investigation, determine that they told the contractor to do X, Y, and Z, and ultimately then it'll go back to the landowner. But it's a matter of responsibility, and you have to follow the law with BMPs, and the responsibility is going to be with the party that made that decision. So if it was the contractor that made the decision, or they didn't follow the BMPs, it goes to the contractor. If the landowner told them to do something and they went ahead and do it, ultimately will go back to the landowner. So that responsibility in Maine is treated a little bit differently.
With enforcement, I mean, we just heard of
Yes.
fines not being paid in Vermont, but there are ways to squeeze the contractors a little bit more in Maine to have them pay those fines.
In Representative O'Brien, in terms of the fines for BMP violations
Exactly,
or
yeah.
timber trespass?
No, BMP violations.
Yeah, the BMP violations, generally the State Forest Service tries to do a good job to work with the contractor to remediate those issues. And then the issue would get remediated. If it's a habitual offender, they're going to get the Attorney General involved, and there will be some type of an official settlement with the contractor that will include, remediation. They could pay a fine. They may have to go to training as a result. It really depends upon the case, how extreme it is. It also depends upon the track record of the contractor. But it all does reside ultimately with the Maine Forest Service, and then they will bring the Attorney General in depending upon what the issue is.
Great. Very helpful. Thank you for that additional testimony. We're just about out of time, so I think we'll wrap it up for this morning. And I'm just going to say as a note to the committee, housekeeping note, we're going to meet at 1. I'm not sure it's on the agenda yet, but it will be shortly. So please be back at 1. We're going to take up the budget adjustment language. Budget adjustment and language.
It's on there.
It's already there, okay, wow. Thank you, Sidonia. Okay, so we'll see everybody back at 1.